So I briefly introduce you. So Dr. Dominic KAEGI is researcher at the Heidelberger Akademie der Wissenschaften. He is also a member of the Stiftungsrat der Karl Jaspers Stiftung. He has contributed to the Karl Jaspers Gesamtausgabe, but he has written also other relevant articles like Die Moral der metaphysischen Schuld, published in 2010, L'éthique non écrite de Cassirer, published in 2012, and Meine Schriften wählen nicht zur Aktualität von Karl Jaspers, published in 2019. So today, Dr. KAEGI closes the session with a reflection on the way in which understanding and value freedom are combined by Jaspers in psychology, proposing an existential understanding that overcomes the common psychological understanding. The title of the presentation is Psychopathology and Humanities in Jaspers. So, Dr. KAEGI, should I understand the PowerPoint in German?
Vielleicht können Sie die PDF von dem Vortrag hochladen.
I cannot. What the text in English or the PowerPoint in
Yes.
German?
The text in English.
Okay, so give me a moment. I open it. This one, yes. Okay, here. Make it a bit bigger. Okay, yes, so when you want, you can start. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Vielen Dank für die Einladung und vor allem an Sie. Vielen Dank für die perfekte Organisation. Das ist wunderbar und ich freue mich sehr, dabei zu sein. When Hans Zahner introduced himself in Basel to study philosophy, Jaspers blocked him. It would be better to start with the science. Zahner replied that he was enrolled for Romance and German studies in Lausanne and worked as a school teacher before entering the university. Okay, said Jaspers, then at least you have something like life experience in your background. The anecdote is symptomatic, on the one hand, of Jaspers' conviction that philosophy is empty without pre-exercise in science. Primum scire deinde philosophari. This sounds like a positivist principle, actually it is one. For Jaspers, however, the pedagogical primacy of science over philosophy arises from the fact that philosophy itself is not science, but something fundamentally other. Etwas fundamental anderes. In order to do justice to this other, one must first know science, and not just know it, but be able to do it. Only if you take science seriously and become a scientific person, you can do true philosophy today, he wrote in a letter to Julius Ebbinghaus. The admonition did not only apply to Ebbinghaus, but to a whole group of authors who, without any scientific experience of their own, declared philosophy to be a science and thus inevitably fell into absurd constructions. According to Jaspers, philosophy as rigorous science, strenge Wissenschaft, Husserl, or philosophy as ontological research, ontologische Forschung, Heidegger, are amateurish projects we should avoid. There is a second aspect in what Zahner tells us about his first encounter with Jaspers. In contrast to his life experience as teacher, the academic training that Zahner could offer obviously did not count in Jaspers' eyes. Literary studies are not sciences in the true sense of the word. Speaking of science, Jaspers means hard science, not moral science, which almost amounts to a contradiction in terms. Now, it's not a fresh insight that Jaspers' concept of science is one-sidedly tailored to the natural science, above all to the ideal of classical Newtonian physics. As with Kant, Jaspers' criteria of scientific knowledge are universality, Allgemeingültigkeit, and certainty, Gewissheit, the two characteristics that qualify what Kant calls synthetic a priori judgments. It is true that Jaspers understands both criteria procedurally. Allgemeingültigkeit means universally accepted methods of verifying hypotheses, and certainties then is the consensus reached in each case, a consensus which may be limited to certain matters, but, this is the crucial point, remains irreversible. Anonymity, Einmütigkeit, in scientific insights is the hallmark of universality. Therefore, scientific progress is structurally, not a daily business, linear. New facts occur and observation that pose puzzles, but it is impossible for any future research to develop a concept of nature that contradicts rather than expand what has been achieved so far. There are no paradigm change at the base because the procedures and methods constitute the concept of nature itself. The humanities, on the other hand, primarily deal with interpretation. Here, too, there may be methods or techniques accepted by large parts of the scientific community, yet this method alone do not generate knowledge. Phenomena in the humanities are not pure data, but culture-dependent and therefore require thick descriptions, which can never be completely objectified. Even in a Kantian term, the conditions of possibility of knowledge in the humanities, laid down, for example, in Historic, as per Roisen, or hermeneutics, don't permit a universally valid anonymous exposure because they are themselves historically evolved and thus are relative to changing valuations and assessments. For sure, Jaspers knew all this, at least at the beginning of his career. Back then, he dealt intensively with Dilthey, who, as he later claimed, never touched me personally. The rediscovery of Hölderlin by Hillingrad fascinated him, especially regarding the philological side, including various styles of handwriting. But above all, however, Jaspers stems from the Baden school of Neo-Kantianism, which is often forgotten. He was a close friend of Emil Lask. Windelband supervised Jaspers' habilitation, and there was a fruitful exchange with Rickert, even if their personal relationship turned into enmity after Weber's death. It is especially this distinction introduced by Windelband and Rickert between the ideographic, individualizing approach of the humanities as opposed to the nomothetic, generalizing method of the natural sciences that should become central to Jaspers' psychopathology. Central not only for the project of an understanding psychology, verstehende Psychologie, the main topic of this paper, but also in view of the significance of philology for psychopathology. Psychopathology is, in some way, literary criticism, not just the study of files. One must be able to carefully read and understand the patient's self-descriptions to get an idea of the whole Krankengeschichte, ideally as a complete biography or pathography, which can serve then as material for an empirically supported nosology. Jaspers systematically pursued such pathographies. Only the famous cases have become known. Strindberg, Van Gogh, Hölderlin, and Nietzsche. To sum it up, it is a whole ensemble of humanities concepts and skills with which the young Jaspers worked. Why did they fall by wayside in the later Jaspers? It's hard to say. At least one can tell a story about it, not how it really was, but how it might have been, because this also is interpretation. I would like to distinguish between three stages. First, that of understanding psychology, say from 1912 to 1919. Second, the criticism of Freud in the second edition of General Psychopathology in 1920. And finally, the marginalization of understanding psychology by existential philosophy, particularly visible in the fourth edition of General Psychopathology of 1946. The theses are as follows. The original plot of understanding psychology combines two elements that do not go together, understanding and value freedom. The tension between the two elements becomes clear in Jaspers' discussion with Freud. Phenomena such as resentment cannot be described neutrally. To understand them means to evaluate them. Third, Jaspers does not draw the conclusion from this to revise his original approach, but contrasts psychological understanding, which continues to be conceived as value-free, with existential understanding. The dichotomy of psychological and existential understanding is complete. It therefore leaves no room for a further concept of understanding in the sense of humanities. Against the background of psychology and clinical psychiatry at the beginning of the 20th century, the idea of an understanding psychology presents a counterproposal to the identification of mind and brain. As Griesinger, we had it already, put it, Geisteskrankheiten sind Gehirnkrankheiten. Jaspers wants to show that mental illness cannot simply be linked to physical organic disorders. Rather, illness refers to a specific form of incomprehensibility, Unverständlichkeit. Not by content, but by design, understanding psychology is a Kantian project. The attempt to make visible the limits of what is understandable by recourse to meaningful context of mental life. The essay on causal and meaningful connections between life history and psychosis, written in 1912, published in 1913, brings in understanding psychology as a subdiscipline of subjective psychology. Subjective psychology has further the task to classify and describe mental states such as thoughts, feelings, ideas, etc. Following Husserl, Jaspers labeled this descriptive part of subjective psychology phenomenology. While phenomenology looks at mental states in isolation, understanding psychology addresses the connections between mental states, is how the mental emerges from the mental, wie Seelisches aus Seelischem hervorgeht. Understanding the connections between mental states is to understand those states genetically, genetisches Verstehen. However, not every genetic understanding is at once psychological. Genetic understanding, for example, of a linguistic utterance is rational when the contents of thoughts emerge intelligibly from one another according to the rules of logic. Speaker and listener here follow the same semantic guidelines and rules of inference, at least in principle. On the other hand, genetic understanding is psychological when we understand the content of thoughts as arising from the moods, wishes, and fears of the thinker. The differentiation between rational and psychological understanding does not specifically concern context of utterance. Such contexts only illustrate particularly well that the connection between mental states can be understood both synchronously and diachronically. Synchronously as a reference system between the proposal contents of ideas, opinions, or beliefs, diachronically as the expression of a palpable motivational relation. If rational understanding only ever leads to the realization that a rational complex, which can be understood without any psychology, what the content of a soul, a mind, empathic understanding leads us into psychological contexts themselves. If rational understanding is only an aid to psychology, empathic understanding is psychology itself. Furthermore, Jaspers takes up the consideration of Simmons to specify the difference between a psychological, in Simmel historical, and rational understanding. To stick with the model of speaker and listener, rationalized understanding reconstructs context. The listener rebuilds, as it were, the speaker's thoughts or ideas. He does not actually understand the speaker, but what is being said. Whereas psychologically, we seek to understand the speaker himself or generally as other persons. It is the motives behind their thoughts and ideas, for example, the jealousy behind the compulsion to control one's partner. So empathetic understanding cannot rely on introspection alone. To see the corresponding connection at all, it must be supplemented by a special intuition of how mental states evoke other mental states. Meaningful connections, verstehbare oder verständliche Zusammenhänge, meaningful connections have only ever been discovered in a new and convincing way through the intuition of rare people. Most of our conscious knowledge of meaningful human mental life flows directly or indirectly from them through the mediation of secondary sources. Jaspers cites Theophrast's characters, the French moralists, and especially the only and greatest of all understanding psychologist Nietzsche. Die Stelle ist auch deswegen interessant, weil sie zeigt, dass er damals 1912, 13 Kierkegaard noch nicht gelesen hatte. When Nietzsche shows us convincingly how moral principles, moral demands, and the religion of redemption arise from the consciousness of weakness, poverty, and suffering, because the soul wants to satisfy its virtual power by this detour despite its weakness, we experience immediate evidence that we cannot trace back any further, that we cannot base on any other evidence. All understanding psychology is based on such experiences of Evidenzerlebnisse, in relation to completely impersonal, detached, meaningful context. But evidential experiences are the foundation of understanding psychology only under certain restrictions. Firstly, the connection between powerlessness and moralism is evident only in an ideal-typical way, not empirical. In extreme cases, the connection holds even if there is no correlated empirical proof of it. Meaningful connections offer patterns of interpretation with which individual real events can be interpreted, but never be reconstructed with absolute certainty. It is the connection that is evident, not its realization. If Nietzsche transfers a convincingly meaningful connection between the consciousness of weakness and morality to the real individual event of the emergence of Christianity, then this transfer to the individual case can be wrong, despite the correctness of the general, ideal-typical understanding of that connection. For Jaspers, the ideal-typical nature of understanding is a flip side of the value freedom of understanding psychology. It is a fact that we evaluate all genetically meaningful correlations positively or negatively. Thus, we disparage the emergence of moral demands from resentment per se. In the science of psychology, however, we have to keep strictly away from all such evaluations. We must grasp and recognize only the meaningful connections as such. The absence of evaluation qualifies understanding psychology as a scientific discipline. The ideal types distinguish it from natural science. It's all about understanding, not about causal explaining. To differentiate between explaining, erklären, and understanding, verstehen, Jaspers uses the distinction mentioned above between the nomothetic procedure of natural sciences and the ideographic procedure of the humanities or cultural studies. Explanation is nomothetic, understanding is ideographic, where the nomothetic procedure, as Jaspers outlines it, largely corresponds to the deductive nomological scheme of causal statements elaborated by Popper, which explain an event by deriving it from a law combined with corresponding initial conditions. Now, Jaspers by no means excludes, but rather presupposes that causal explanations function, or at least should function, in exactly the same way in psychology. The obvious idea, he says against Dilthey, that the psychological, the realm of understanding, the physical, the realm of causal explanation is wrong. There is no real occurrence, whether physical or mental, that is not in principle accessible to causal explanation. Mental occurrences can also be subjected to causal explanation. So deceptive imaginations can be explained by an eye injury if there is a statistically sufficiently proven lawful connection between, say, macular degeneration and hallucination. But when mental occurrences are to be explained in the sense of a causality from within, there are not even inductive rules secured by frequency, which could function as part of the explanans. The rules that apply here are the meaningful connections themselves, for example, between jealousy and the experience of being betrayed, or as with resentment, between powerlessness and aggression. Understanding psychology, then, is the interpretation of mental life in the light of ideally meaningful connections, not the derivation of mental processes from causal laws. Under these guidelines, the concept of mental illness can finally be operationalized. To put it bluntly, ill is what is incomprehensible in terms of meaningful connections. This incomprehensibility, or Jaspers' theorem, initially applies to individual phenomena, such as delusional ideas, Wahnideen, which can no longer be understood meaningfully and therefore must be explained by a somatic cause. Somatic processes, as Jaspers calls them, can be assumed because every mental occurrence correlates with some somatic occurrence. However, the correlation turns out to be so complicated that we are practically dealing with some sort of Cartesian physical parallelism, a parallelism without attribution, ohne eindeutige Zuordnung. Either, as in the case of paralysis, for example, there is a physical process, a brain process, a somatic cause, then experience teaches that whatever such definable brain process has been found, all possible psychopathic and psychotic symptoms occur with them, that the common feature in the psychic field is only the formation of defects. It means the brain process has a diffuse causal effect in the most diverse directions. Or it is a question of a large group of psychic processes, changes in personality, changes in mental life, which in many cases correspond to the Bloilerian type of schizophrenia. The notion of process then works as a placeholder for unknown somatic causes of personality change, or a pointer, Zeiger, to such causes with psychopathology can approach only asymptotically via the path of individual disease histories. It is as if an unknown continent is being explored from two sides, but the explorers do not meet because there is always a wide, impenetrable land between them. For psychoanalysis, the map looks quite different. Jaspers first commented on Freud on the above-mentioned causal and meaningful connections. Here, psychoanalysis is seen as a contribution to understanding psychology and as a very significant one. Jaspers speaks of the extraordinarily interesting content of these doctrines, which alone makes it worthwhile to loosen up the deadlocked front lines between Freudians and Freud detractors. We endeavor to work positively on what makes sense to us and to arrive at a critical position. The critical position is based on several points, the central one being the objection that Freud confuses meaningful connections with causal explanations. Freud is actually about understanding psychology, not causal explanation as Freud thinks. Catchy examples are provided by the analysis of linguistic mistakes. I ask you to burp to our boss. Following Freud, the slip of the tongue, aufstoßen instead of anstoßen, arises from the interference of two intentions. The disturbed counteracted intention to make a toast to the boss, and the disturbing intention is not the boss. For Jaspers, Uncovering this interference means gaining insight into an obvious connection between what the toast speaker wants and what he says, and thus is a lesson in understanding psychology. Mental issues arise from mental issues. The unintentionally insult arises from a feeling of inferiority. According to Jaspers, however, this only means to rise to conscious, ins Bewusstsein heben, something unnoticed, the speaker's unconscious intention. Freud's tableau is far more elaborated. Freud assumes that the speaker represses his actual intention so that the pent-up impulse is discharged in an uncontrolled manner. With this, a causal dimension comes into play that Jaspers doesn't even envisage. His concept of conscious is as the unnoticed, das Unbemerkte, rather corresponds to Freud's concept of the preconscious, while what Freud calls unconscious is extra-conscious, außerbewusst, for Jaspers. Extra-conscious mental processes have the same methodological status as extra-conscious physical processes. Like physical processes, they are postulates for causally explaining the psyche. In contrast to physical processes, however, unconscious mental process cannot be observed, so that every individual case of psychoanalytical explanation must remain stuck in the hypothetical. If he follows Jaspers' scheme, causal relationships exist at best between the extra-conscious and the conscious, but not between the unconscious and the conscious. On the second level, there are only meaningful connections that can be found but not explained. Husserl later adopted these differentiations and developed them into a detailed argument against psychoanalysis. Jaspers does not go so far when he warns against overstretching the approach of understanding psychology. For by throwing intelligible and causal connections into one another, by explaining the slip of the tongue through an unconscious cause, Freud universalizes the intelligible. The incorrectness of Freud's claim that everything in the life of the soul, that every process is comprehensible, meaningfully determined, is based on the confusion of meaningful connections with causal connections. Essentially, the confrontation with Freud is completed at this point. Jaspers adopts the text published in the Schizophrenia essay without any changes in all editions of the general psychopathology. Only on the outside, it seems that the whole thing still has some play. While Jaspers' criticism of psychoanalysis stagnated in substance, it became increasingly aggressive in tone. The impression is not wrong, but it overlooks the fact that it was not Jaspers' view of Freud that subsequently changed, but his attitude towards understanding psychology. The turning point is the psychology of worldviews, above all, the conception of borderline situation. With the discovery of the antinomic structures as a basic human situation, Grundsituation des Daseins, understanding psychology takes a move toward the appellative, even if Jaspers' psychology of worldviews undermine the claims to orientation that could be expected from post-war literature, 1919. Those who want a direct answer to the question of how they should live will seek it in vain in this book. The preface from 1919 rejects. The book has only meaning for those who experience life as a personal, irrational responsibility that cannot be abrogated by anything. Responsibility is irrational because identity-forming decisions can never be fully justified biographically and must therefore be taken on and borne by the subject themselves. Whatever this means in detail, irrationality and the unjustifiability of the ultimate motives for action or life-sustaining attitudes is obviously not the same as the incomprehensibility of pathological systems. The intrusion into the personality in a process makes madness, but not existential unconditionality. While pathological symptoms point to a break in a normal, meaningful development of personality, The unfoundability of action is an experience of freedom. Understanding psychology can only do justice to this by no longer merely stating meaningful connections in a value-free manner, but by placing them within the horizon of a self-responsible living. This horizon remains unrecognizable for the psychologist and in practice for the psychiatrist. The understanding psychologist is not to anticipate the concrete lifestyles of others or make decisions about them in an advisory capacity. All the more, he must be prepared to reveal his own values and to position himself. Instead of appealing to the vital and sexual, as Freud did, one can also appeal to the spiritual in people and develop their psychology. Freud's view of what arises from the repression of sexuality is often extraordinarily accurate, but he doesn't even ask what arises from the repression of spirit. Focusing on the life-threatening repression of spirit instead of sexuality does not make for a better psychology, just a different one, but it is decisive that now the conflict of interpretation itself becomes part of understanding psychology. The conflict of opinions belongs to understanding psychology because there is a close connection between understanding psychology and the personality that turns to it. Here, therefore, one always simultaneously asks about the person who sees, asserts, rejects something. The battle of understanding insights becomes a battle of personalities. This, then, is the turn that the criticism of Freud takes in the second edition of General Psychopathology, 1920, and it certainly also reflects Jaspers' indecision as to whether a psychology of worldviews based on the experience of borderline situations can still be understanding psychology. It is the description of meaningful connections extended to possible links between attitudes, Einstellungen, and images of the world, Weltbilder. He later distanced himself from the typology of worldviews as a psychological project and recognized it as the first expression of existential philosophical thought only under a false name, so to speak. But what then about understanding psychology? Jaspers did not abandon the postulate of value freedom for understanding psychology. Instead, he opened a new contrast between psychological understanding and existential understanding, leading to considerable problems in the fourth edition of General Psychopathology, problems which are not merely terminological. For Jaspers, at any rate, the distinction between psychological and existential understanding seems complete. Psychological understanding is oriented towards ideal-typical context and is value-free, while existential understanding is situation-related and serves to illuminate existence. As I value, he said in the third part of philosophy, as I value, so I am, and so I become. The distinction between the two forms of understanding marks the place, or rather the options, that remain for the humanities. They either attempt, in the manner of an understanding psychology, to empirically explore what can be understood as meaning, das als Sinn verstehbare empirisch zu erforschen, and then run into danger of losing themselves in endless particularities. Or they, in the German text here has singular, die Geisteswissenschaft, or they embark on the path to existence, begeben sich auf den Weg zur Existenz, already struck by it, the Geisteswissenschaft, it creates new reality by participating in ideas and grasping the real itself. As a path to the illumination of existence, it is unique, indirect, and objectively incomprehensible. Objektiv unfassbar und gleichzeitig Wissenschaft. Formulated with high demands, this is quite obviously a play for the dissolution of the humanities into philosophy. Jaspers paid a price for this, which can be assessed as high or low. a typical mistake, or at least a temptation, is the elevation of interpretations to sources. In his account of German resistance, to give just one example, Jaspers vividly visualizes the story of the Scholz siblings. But he refers exclusively to Inge Scholz's account, which is read much more critically today, because in her own way, Inge Scholz did not just give reports and interpretations, but created a myth. Of course, Jaspers cannot be blamed for the fact that we now value Scholz's text differently. Resistance research in today's sense did not exist in the early 1950s, and if it had, Jaspers might have taken note of it. The point is that Jaspers does not even consider a possible revision of his account by future historical research. As a result, many of his writings touching historical topics meanwhile are themselves only of historical interest, or are dismissed as documents of zeitgeist. Surely this does not justice to them, but has its reasons in a sort of self-inflicted dilettantism. Or should we say self-chosen dilettantism? Hermann Lübbe handed down the bon mot, let your speech be yes, yes, no, no, the rest goes to your camp, a very famous German publisher. Jaspers' prevalence for the natural sciences could also be taken in this sense. Yes and no exist in the realm of exact science. The rest is a matter of value judgment and viewpoints anyway. It is then important to make the evaluations as transparent as possible, to disclose them and not to drape them in a pseudo-scientific manner. Applied to the humanities, that would certainly correspond to Jaspers' criticism of Freud. I suspect that Jaspers actually followed this line. The humanities provide orientation through interpretation, but not theories that can be empirically verified or falsified. Of course, orientation requires values and attitudes. You have to consider resistance against dictatorship valuable, to cut a long story short, in order to be interested in the history of the White Rose at all. But for Jaspers, such values are a matter of philosophical reflection, and not just reflection, but of life, which absorbs them and gives them substance. In the end, this is not so far removed from Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics. Concerning the debate between Gadamer and Habermas, Jaspers would have been on Gadamer's side if he had been forced to make a statement at all. Besides, the historical development went the other way around, from Jaspers to Gadamer. The analogy could perhaps be spun out even further. For Jaspers and Gadamer compensate for the gap that arises in the humanities when value judgments are a matter of philosophy by charging philosophizing with a bourgeois educational dimension. This is not meant as criticism, on the contrary. Both, Jaspers even more so than Gadamer, represent a type of sovereign scholarship that was characteristic of the 19th century, in which the modern humanities emerged from the bankruptcy of Hegel's philosophy of mind. But perhaps this kind of scholarship has itself become a thing of the past, and we must face up the challenge of Rorty's proposal that philosophy, for its part, should be dissolved into properly, means pragmatic, understood history and literary studies. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. KAEGI, for this really insightful presentation about psychology in Jaspers. There is Professor O'Leary, who is ready for his questions. So.
Yes, fascinating talk. I just pick up the last word, literary studies. I don't at all agree with Rorty, but nonetheless, literary studies have a very important role. On the one hand, you have principles and be the ideal typisch or situationel existentiel. And on the other hand, you have the vast, uncontrollable empiricism of real life. What you have in novels, in the French psychological novel, for example, is a personality who is well-rounded and analyzed in thorough depth in a kind of verstehende Psychologie, which is also an introspective Psychologie. Then you have the question of the unconscious. You mentioned schizophrenia and other things that really defeat that kind of lucid understanding and demand an intuition that goes beyond mere Verstehen into realizing there is some other force at work here, which is the unconscious in Freud. And there are some novelists who can reach that level. Dostoevsky is the most famous instance. There's a kind of enlightening intuition in Dostoevsky. Where does it come from? It's a golden trove, treasure trove for Freud. So the point I'm trying to make is that literary studies should have a secure place, You have philosophy and then general theory on one side, you have real life on the other, to negotiate between the two and to enable, to be a bridge between the two. The classics of psychological novels, which originated in France, maybe with La Princesse de Clèves or with the French classical theatre of Racine. And before that in theology, of course, theology is a very psychological science. But that tradition of the psychological novel, which also sometimes is an autobiographical or confessional novel, again, very much like Saint Augustine, culminating in Proust, for example. Now, one thing I would say, many novelists think they know better than Freud. They say, we don't need Freud. We have a superior understanding. Joyce would say that, and many others. But I don't think they're right, because I think unless they're Dostoevsky, they're not right? I mean, maybe Dostoevsky goes beyond Freud. Maybe Nietzsche goes beyond Freud. Maybe James Joyce, I don't know, goes beyond Freud here and there. But novelists are very foolish if they think they know better than Freud, as a general rule.
Darf ich auf Deutsch antworten?
Oh, ja, that's fine.
Also ich glaube, Jaspers war genau dieser Ansicht, dass Nietzsche, vielleicht sogar auch Dostojewski und später sicher auch Kierkegaard, uns größere psychologische Einsichten vermitteln als zum Beispiel die Psychoanalyse. Was er unter anderem mit dem Konzept der verstehenden Psychologie verbindet, war eben diese Einsichten, die bei Nietzsche oder anderen großen Schriftstellern und Philosophen und Psychologen unkoordiniert und, wie soll man sagen, willkürlich und kreativ zusammenschießen, die zu systematisieren und in eine methodisch geformte und informierte, verstehende Psychologie umzubilden. Aber der Punkt, den Sie zum Schluss gemacht haben, finde ich, entspricht sehr der Jaspersen Vorstellung. Es gibt so eine Zwischengattung zwischen Literatur, Philosophie, Ethik, die Grundlage ist für das Verständnis von Menschen, damals sagte er noch nie Existenz, von menschlichem Seelenleben, auf das es in der verstehenden Psychologie ankommt.
Yes, but I would say that the psychological novel, a great one, is kind of inexhaustible. It's constantly instructive for the psychologist as well. And as I said, there's two kinds. There's the verstehende kind, and there's the ones that really bring the unbewusstes, the unconscious, or something like it. There are forces in Dostoevsky that you cannot explain in terms of a rational, verstehende psychology, like things that happen that, you cannot fully explain them. I mean, Crime and Punishment, why does he kill the old lady? Of course, most novels are not of any value at all, but these novels, which are in a tradition where there's a whole method of handling things. I mean, if you read the French novels, they influence each other, and it goes all the way down to to Rousseau, to Balzac, to Flaubert, to Proust. And there's a study of human nature going on, a psychological study. And yet, none of them reached Dostoevsky in terms of addressing the obscurities of madness, of what we call madness. Some 20th century novelists do, perhaps. They go beyond this clear, rational, psychological study. And of course, since novelists often deal with extreme situations, like murder and so on, whether they are rational or not, the situation itself is irrational, you know? Like in Balzac, the characters are lucidly understood, and yet their behavior is sometimes so strange that you feel Balzac is looking at his own creatures and wondering what on earth are they up to.
But we can understand Raskolnikov, or can't we?
Can we understand it? Not entirely, I would say. It's thoroughly analyzed. You can't understand neither Raskolnikov nor the fellow in the Prince Mushkin nor the people in Devils. You can understand them to a certain point, but you know, I mean, Dostoevsky lived with these people. He knew them. I mean, he was in prison with murderers, right? He knew that they never are converted. They never say, I was wrong. And Raskolnikov never says he was wrong. At the very end of the novel, he has not been converted at all. He may be in the future. So he's dealing here with the opacity, the incomprehensibility of a human being, which he has kind of dreamt up out of his own experiences.
Okay, but then it's not a sense of incomprehensibility as a form of illness or madness. It is a personality which belongs to human being, to human existence.
The incomprehensibility of evil, right? Why do people do evil things which are totally suicidal and self-destructive? Or again, you mentioned epilepsy, and of course Dostoevsky was an epileptic, and or maybe there's somebody else who mentioned epilepsy as a mental illness, and as a I think whoever it was linked it with Alzheimer's disease and schizophrenia. So Dostoevsky was an epileptic, and he had visions, you know, epilepsy. Before you have the seizure, you have a kind of an ecstasy. So this is a source of his writing, but it's a source that comes from elsewhere than a normal, rational Verstehenspsychologie. Crime and madness. That's Dostoevsky's specialty, crime and madness.
Yes, I think you're clearly right, but ich muss es auf Deutsch sagen, Entschuldigung. Ich habe dazu nichts gesagt, das betrifft eben die Seite der Produktivität von Krankheit. Das hat zunächst nichts mit der verstehenden Psychologie zu tun, sondern mit einer Erfahrung, die für Jaspers sehr wichtig war und die er vor allem an und mit Van Gogh gemacht hat, nämlich die Erfahrung, dass selbst schwere Krankheit nicht einfach bedeutet Lebensunfähigkeit oder Existenzuntüchtigkeit, sondern ganz nicht nur tiefe Einblicke in das, was menschliches Dasein ist, vermitteln kann, sondern selber eine bestimmte und individuelle Form von Existenz darstellt. Das gilt sicher für Dostojewski, für Van Gogh, für Hölderlin. Für Strindberg gilt es nach Jaspers gerade nicht. Und es ist interessant, dass er da noch Unterschiede macht. Entschuldigung für das Deutsch.
Oh, This is good. There is a question.
Yes.
Isaac?
Yes, I want to go back to something near the beginning of your paper, where you talked about the somatic dimension as being essential to every psychic event. So to the mind-body problem that you hinted at might be a kind of dualism. And it's not simply in psychopathology, but also it passes over into philosophy, this the importance of the somatic in human existence, human existence is bodily as well as spiritual. He was very tolerant of the language he used for spirit, mind, psyche, consciousness, soul. He accepted them all because I think they were part of the unknowable. But my question is this dualism, mind-body dualism or dichotomy, even though it's not Cartesian, two separate substances, but is this idea of a spiritual dimension and a physical dimension, does that carry over into the transcendent and into the encompassing? In other words, is it possible to have a somatic dimension or even necessary or essential in the transcendent? I realize that he doesn't pronounce on the ontology of the transcendent or the encompassing, that is to say, on God or on the nature of being. So he doesn't answer the question, does God exist? What is God? What's the nature of being? Is being eternal? He doesn't answer those things. But does that mean that there's a possibility that the transcendent and the encompassing are not spirit, but that they also have a bodily dimension? Is that a possibility for him? Or does he kind of implicitly suggest that the body belongs only to the world? And if so, on what grounds?
Nein, ich glaube, dass das für ihn durchaus möglich ist. Transzendenz differenziert sich ja aus in die verschiedenen Weisen des Umgreifenden, various forms of encompassing. Und eine Weise des Umgreifenden ist die Natur oder der menschliche Leib. Das heißt, wir können wie wir diese verschiedenen Weisen des Umgreifenden zusammendenken, das ist auch, glaube ich, ein für Jaspers offenes Problem. Aber wir können gar nicht anders, wenn wir Transzendenz denken, sie auch als Natur zu denken.
Yes, but the encompassing includes nature. It is not nature. It's not God either. It includes them. It's being, mystery of being. And is being essentially, or even potentially always, have a somatic dimension? That's my question for Jaspers. Or does he allow the possibility?
Es gibt ja das Umgreifende auch als Welt.
Yeah, okay. Is it spiritual? Is it spiritual?
Nein, das ist nach meinem Verständnis Natur. Es gibt das Umgreifende als Welt, es gibt das Umgreifende als Geist. Und das sind nicht jetzt einzelne Dinge in der Welt oder einzelne geistige Dinge, sondern das ist Geist und Natur als etwas gedacht, was unser Verhalten in der Welt oder zueinander, wenn wir kommunizieren, überhaupt erst ermöglicht. Und das sind Formen von Transzendenz, die wir denken müssen, wenn wir Transzendenz überhaupt denken. Das ist nicht nur Gott. Also der theologische Ansatz ist da, glaube ich, sehr, sehr wichtig und das ist ein Ansatz, der durchaus perspektivisch ist.
Yes, I understand that transcendence is not the Christian God, but he often says transcendence or God. And the encompassing includes God and all beings. It's kind of his word for Heidegger's Sein, as opposed to Zionism. And so my question is it essentially somatic? Not does it include somatic things? Of course it does. It includes the world. But is the Umgreifende, is it transcendent? Is that a transcendence? Is that spiritual? I mean, the Christian tradition understands God as spiritual. And if so, then we would have the image of God in us this is by the Christian image, the Christian story, by our spirit, by our soul, by our mind. And that what's eternal is the spirit or the soul. Or
I think the argument for in Jaspers is that if we have to think transcendence,
yes.
we have to go beyond subject-object dichotomy, Subjekt-Objekt-Unterschied. And the encompassing is that which umgreift diese Subjekt-Objekt-Spaltung.
Okay.
And that which goes beyond the subject-object division has various, so to say, various phases. And one phase of this encompassing, and so one form of transcendence is nature, or world, if you want. Another form is mind. Another form is consciousness, and so on. And I think, but I'm not sure whether Jaspers himself was confident with this.
Yes.
What is our attempt to conceptualize these various phases of transcendence as one and the same. This is, I think, the idea of his periodontology. But if you ask if is thematic, is there a relation between the thematic and transcendence in Jaspers? I would say clearly yes.
Aren't there two different Jaspers? There's a psychotherapist who the somatic becomes an executive thing within, and this is a brilliant Jaspers. I didn't know there were 4 editions, but it doesn't seem to link up very obviously with the wider ideas that you're talking about.
Yes, that was the way I began my question. Does that dualism pass over into the philosophy?
It's not dualism. I mean, it's normal when you're examining a patient to say, is the problem psychic or somatic? Okay. It's not a real dualism, I don't think.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh. Yes. No more questions online and in present. So, okay, I think that we can close also this 3rd session. So thanks everyone online and in person for joining. I think we did a quite good job.